My name is Caitlin Holt, and I'm the Manager of Education at Brooklyn Public Library's Center for Brooklyn History. Today, I'll be joined by fellow BPL and Brooklyn Museum colleagues, as well as representatives from the Native American community. Just going to move through our slides. Hopefully, a few more people are coming in as we go. I'd like to go over our objective for today, which is to learn about the history, culture, and contemporary issues faced by U.S. federally recognized Lenape, Delaware nations, and receive guidance on how to make curricular connections to these themes. Participants who successfully complete the session will be able to submit their information for 2 CTLE credits upon completing the evaluation survey at the end of today's session. You can follow our agenda and access today's supplemental materials and the digitized session booklet shared via email and in the chat box. Before we get started, I'd like to share some housekeeping instructions and review the code of conduct for today's session. First, here's the agenda that we'll be going through. And again, you can access this from our booklet. The first line of housekeeping, if you haven't done so already, we would ask you to please add your name and pronouns to your profile. You can do this by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your window. Once it pops up, find and hover over your name in the participants list and click More and then rename from the options provided. You can now edit your name and add your pronouns, such as they, them, she, her, he, him, he, they, whichever pronouns you would prefer to use. We encourage you all to utilize Zoom's chat box to share your ideas, comments, and concerns. Staff will closely monitor the chat and be on hand to provide technical assistance, offer clarification, and share resources referenced in the presentations. You can access the chat box by clicking on the chat icon on the bottom of your window. However, you should utilize the Q&A feature, also located at the bottom of your window, to share your questions for our presenters specifically. You can submit these at any time throughout the presentation, and dedicated staff will collate them to share with our presenters during the Q&A portion of today's session. We are committed to ensuring our events, activities, and materials are accessible to all individuals, including those with disabilities. Please email our staff with your preferred communication method if you require accessibility accommodations, including a transcript of this session. Lastly, we want to disclose that while this session is being recorded and will be shared after the event concludes, comments shared through the chat feature will not be saved or shared. Now for the code of conduct. Our events are intended to create a space that nurtures a community of educators that is inclusive of all, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, religion, age, sexual orientation, ability, or stage of professional development. All attendees are expected to show respect to presenters, organizers, and other attendees. This event will contain discussion about issues related to race, bias, and oppression that can be difficult to talk about. As an attendee, you may at times feel uncomfortable with the issues and opinions shared. If you find yourself struggling with the topic of discussion, it is appropriate to walk away from your computer and take a break. It is not appropriate to respond by sharing hateful ideologies, racist language, or confrontational viewpoints. Hateful and racist behavior will be considered a violation of the code of conduct and result in immediate expulsion from the event. We ask you to actively listen, be sensitive to the anxieties and concerns of your fellow participants, and show support for one another. Again, please reach out if you need help. Use the chat feature if you have a technology issue, want to clarify something, or have concerns about another participant's behavior. You can also privately message staff through the chat feature if your concern is sensitive. Find us by looking for the word co-host beside our names in the participant list. I would now like to introduce today's facilitator, Nancy Rosoff. Nancy joined the Brooklyn Museum in 2001 and is the Andrew W. Mellon Senior Curator for Arts of the Americas. As such, she is responsible for the care and curation of the museum's pre-Columbian and Native American art collections, consisting of approximately 35,000 objects. Prior to joining the Brooklyn Museum, she was Assistant Director for Museum Operations and Collection Manager at the New York Historical Society, and an Associate Curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. A graduate of Connecticut College in New London, Nancy is the recipient of an MA in Anthropology from the University of California, Los Angeles. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen, and Nancy is going to take over from here.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Caitlin. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the Brooklyn Public Library and the Brooklyn Museum stand on land that is part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape, Delaware people. As a sign of respect, we recognize and honor the Lenape, Delaware nations, their elders past and present, and future generations. I will be introducing each representative before he or she speaks, and it would be great if they would explain how their nations are connected to the Lenape people of New York, since this workshop is about Native Americans in New York. And you're going to hear the speakers that we have are from nations all over the country. And so their remarks will shed insight as to why that exists, why that is the case. Our first speaker is Chief Mark Peters. Chief Peters is an enrolled member of the Munsee-Delware Nation in Ontario, Canada, and he was just elected chief again this past March. He is a historian and has served as the tribe's historian for many years. Chief Peters is also a lawyer and has been directly involved in the justice system and has a strong understanding of Aboriginal rights and First Nations legal issues. So Chief Peters, take it away.
Good afternoon. Kawingane Walomwa, it's good to see everybody. Ninda Shinzi, Kike Mark Peters. My name is Chief Mark Peters. And Ninunjiai Nalahi, the Munsee-Delware Nation. I live up the river, you could say, from Nahi, which is the Lenape Lakewit Nation down the river in the Munsee-Delware Nation. So it's good to be here this afternoon. And I've got a bit of an outline of what you would like me to talk about. So yes, we live here on what's called the Thames River, also known as the Deshkan-Zibi and the Ojibwe or Chippewa language in southwestern Ontario. We live geographically connected to two other First Nations, as we call ourselves in Canada. One of them is the Chippewas of the Thames, and the other is the Oneida Nation of the Thames, who we all live in this particular area on the Thames River in southwestern Ontario, Canada. We moved here around the end of the American Revolution into what was then known as Upper Canada around 1783. But we're known as the Munsee-Delware Nation Reserve Number 1. And the word reserve is the same as reservation in the United States. I don't know how we got the number 1 in there, but that's us. Anyway, there's some 500 First Nations in Canada. And we have a reserve here of 2,600 acres. It's a far cry from the lands we once possessed in Lenape-Hoking in the northeastern United States, but it's what we have at the present time. And we are governed by what's called the Indian Act, believe it or not, here in Canada. It's a rather archaic, patriarchic law that was created back in the 1880s, 1870 period. And we're still expected to follow under this law to a certain degree, although things are changing a bit. But it's an example of how we are governed entirely by the federal government here compared to the kind of sovereignty that tribes have in the US. But we have a community. We have 200 people or so that live here on the reserve. We have 600 members all in North America, worldwide. We have the types of programs and services that any small town might have. We have our administration. We have education department. We have a daycare, employment and training, a healing lodge, a police service. We have a college located here, and various social services and other activities that we assist our members with. So we are under this law, like I say, the Indian Act, which means we have elections here every 2 years. We have an election to choose a chief and council. And we have a chief and 4 councilors in our small community, but it's actually no different than the traditional way of government we had hundreds of years ago. And even up until today, there's always been a chief, is my understanding, and councilors in the Muncie villages way back to when we were in the Brooklyn area, which I'm going to get to. But so that's a bit of how we're structured. Like I say, we've been here since the time of the end of the American Revolution when we moved into Upper Canada. But the Muncie people, and the Munsee-Delware people, I should say, we are part of the larger Lenape, Delaware people in area we come to know as Lenape Hoking in southeastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and southern New York, Manhattan Island, and Long Island. And it's Muncie-speaking people that occupied the area of Brooklyn, to my understanding, people such as the Canarsie, the Gowanus, the Yumeko, the Wendawanenock, Matinacock, and such. I'm just reading a map on my wall with those names on it. But again, the people in this area were known to have spoken the Muncie dialect of the Lenape, Delaware language, and had quite a large number of villages in the Brooklyn area, Manhattan, and other areas on the Hudson River, stretching all the way over to the Delaware River, actually. And, you know, over time, well, first of all, I just like to maybe mention that we were, according to our oral histories and traditions, were present when the first ship came into New York Harbor, and there's descriptions of that in a book by John Heckwelder of the stories that were told to him by our ancestors in the 1700s. So, you know, from that time on, we accepted the Europeans onto our lands with as friends, from my understanding, and got along pretty good for a certain amount of time, and then land became an issue, and we started to lose our lands in those areas, and were pushed over into what's become known as the Minnesink area on the Delaware River, the Delaware Water Gap area, and were eventually continued to be pushed further and further west due to the increasing numbers of people that were coming into the country needing land, and we were unfortunately experienced significant fraudulent behavior and downright theft sometimes of our lands, which again pushed us further and further west. And eventually we became involved in a number of wars, the French Indian War, 7 Years' War it's known, and the American Revolution, as I mentioned. We sided with Britain at the time, and all of our villages in the Susquehanna Valley were burnt and destroyed, as well as our resources, and we had no choice but to move into Upper Canada, where we are now. But we continued to take part in what's known as the Indian Wars in the Northwest from 1780s to the 1790s, and then the War of 1812, which was a war between Canada and the US, which we fought on the side of the British and were able to keep this country, at least in the hands of the British. And we allied with them for many, many years, actually. And like I say, we moved here based on the promise of a treaty for that alliance. But after we moved here, and after other nations in this area made significant treaties and relationships, when the colonial governments came in, all of a sudden those past treaties, those honorable agreements that we had made with the British Crown were no longer being recognized. We were we'd lost a lot of our population from disease and war and such. And so we didn't have the strength and power that we once had. And the laws, like I say, the Indian Act started to basically tell us what we had to do and how we had to be. And even laws of what you call forced assimilation were created here, including what's known as the Residential Act. It's happened in the US as well, where kids were forcibly taken from their homes and sent to schools where they were prevented from speaking their languages, from learning their customs and ceremonies and such. And this continued on here until the 1970s and 80s even. So we've been subject to some pretty bad laws and policies of our government after being allies with them for a long time. But since the 1970s, our leaders sort of got together to make a stand, and we had laws entrenched in our Constitution, guaranteeing our Aboriginal rights and such. And we are starting to get more and more control over our communities as we have now. And things are starting to get a little better. So I don't know if I've gone 15 minutes yet. Something like that. But that's about who we are and how we came to be here on the Thames River from the area of Brooklyn in New York.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mark, for those remarks. Curtis pointed out that I neglected to read the last sentence of Brooklyn's land acknowledgement. So I'm going to say it here before I introduce our next speaker. So the third and last sentence of our land acknowledgement says that we, and this is the Brooklyn Museum's land acknowledgement, we are committed to addressing exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and confronting the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism in our work. And this is very important. And I'm glad that Curtis pointed it out, that this is really the next step. Land acknowledgement can only go so far, but then what are we going to do next to address how Indigenous people have been erased from the history of the United States and Canada? So thank you very much, Curtis, for bringing that up. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Heather Bruegl. Ms. Bruegl is an enrolled member of the United Nation of Wisconsin and a first-line descendant of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of the Mohican Indians in Bowler, Wisconsin. She is a historian with a focus on Native American history, policy, and activism, and is currently the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee Band. Thank you so much. Heather, your remarks, please.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for having me on this panel today. I'm very excited to be part of it, and I'm currently coming to you from my home. So two things. One, I have two dogs behind me, so if they start barking, I apologize. And secondly, I am off reservation today. I live off the reservation, so I am coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Menominee Nation, whose ancestral home is Wisconsin. So I just wanted to make that acknowledgement as well. I am currently the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge-Munsee community. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, which has its original homelands in New York. And I'm also a first-line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee, which also has their homelands out in New York as well. What makes Stockbridge-Munsee unique is we're a collection of several tribes that came together. We are our we are mainly made up of the Mohican Nation, whose home is along the Mohican River Valley, and you know that as the Hudson River Valley. One of our main capitals is now present-day Albany, and we had our homelands in that area, and there was just along the river bend, the Mohican, which is the river that flows both ways, and we are the Mohican people, which is the people of the waters that are never still. And then Oneida is also people of the standing stone. So we have a rich and diverse history in New York. We are unfortunately not able to be in our homelands anymore due to forced removal. So we have a history of fighting with the colonists during the American Revolution. We fought with the colonists. We helped gain independence for those people who were fighting to throw off the shackles of Great Britain. But along with that help came basically the demise, I would say, of Native nations in the New England and Northeast area. Because shortly after the war ended in 1783, we were forced westward. But before we were forced westward, a little piece of history, a little trivia, so if you're on Jeopardy, George Washington, who was the first president of the United States and who was the commander of the Continental Army, threw an ox roast for the Mohican people for the help that they gave during the American Revolution. And that took place in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And that's actually how we got part of our name, Stockbridge. That's how we became known as the Stockbridge people, Stockbridge Indians. And it was right after that ox roast where we were thanked for the work that we did on behalf of, the Stockbridge militia, which was very instrumental fighting with the colonists to, overthrow Great Britain. We were then forced westward. But what's significant about us is while we were in New York, while we were still in New York, we were joined up with some of the Muncie people who had left the New Jersey area. We were also joined with some of the Brothertown people who had left their particular area as well. And we were living on Oneida land at that time. After that, we were forced to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where we were then, we all decided to travel together. So that's where the Muncie part of our name comes from. So there were some Munsee-Delware, Lenape people who did travel with us through our move westward. And so we had a couple of stops along the way, a couple of stops in New York. Again, we had Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Then we had a stop in Indiana. And then finally, we were moved to Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we had two settlements that are in the southern part of the state near Lake Winnebago. Our first settlement was actually a place called, or one of the settlements was Kaukauna, Wisconsin, which is on the east side of Lake Winnebago. And then we also had Stockbridge, Wisconsin, which is also on the east side of Lake Winnebago. They're literally right on top of each other if you were to look at a map. And we settled there. We, set up town, we set up a school. The first, so to speak, the first public school teacher in the state Wisconsin was part of the Michigan territory. So but in what would become the state of Wisconsin was Electa Quinney, and she was a Stockbridge-Munsee woman. And she didn't just teach the Native children, she taught all children. And so we like to have that little claim to fame that we had the first public school teacher in what would become the state of Wisconsin. After that, after we had set up everything, set up lumber mills, set up schools, set up, little grocery stores, we were then forced to move again. And finally, through the Treaty of 1856, we are in our current location, which is the reservation that is about 40 minutes west of where I currently am. And so it's two townships, Red Springs and Bartlemy. And there was a great deal of lumber in that area. And so much like everything else, we fell to the lumber barons that would come into the area, clear the lumber, virtually destroy the land. They were not practicing forestry in a very environmentally safe way. And so we lost some land. Through perseverance, through the different legislation, and through the hard work of our people, we were able to gain some of that land back. And we currently have around 22,000 acres, which of course is just a fraction of what we had when we were out east. The Great Mohican Territory is very vast, as is the Lenape Territory. And so we have just a fraction of what we used to have. And much of it is trust land. And then there's also the aspect of it being fee land, which is where you are putting it in the process of putting it into trust. We have a small community here, just over 1,500 people, and we are a vibrant community. I didn't grow up here in Wisconsin at all. I actually am from Detroit, so I'm used to faster pace, big city, that kind of life. And so moving here to take this position as the Director of Cultural Affairs has been a learning curve, but being able to live or to work on the reservation land that so many of the elders that I encounter every day were born on, grew up on, tell the stories of, it's been so amazing. And to learn the perseverance of the Stockbridge-Munsee people has been absolutely wonderful. I'm learning while we are a small nation, we are a vibrant nation, and we have many of our traditions and cultures that we are bringing to the forefront again. And one of the things that has been most important to bring back is our language revitalization. And we are unique in that aspect because we have two official languages of the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe. We have our Munsee language, which work on that to bring it back to the tribe to speak, started in the 1970s with trips to Canada and out east to learn the language and to bring it back. And it is spoken, I'm not going to say fluently, but quite often. And we do have Munsee language classes that we do bring to the community. Obviously, we do it virtually now due to this pandemic, but it's brought in a bigger audience. The other thing that we have is we have an official recognized language of Mohican, and Mohican was all but extinct by the time we started to bring it back around. And we had to bring that language back around through the help of linguists and documents that were written and finding the words, and then basically through word of mouth, just asking, our elders in the community, think back to when you were little. Do you remember your parents saying any words? Do you remember your grandparents saying any words? So really focusing on what we could find and bring that back. So as our language manager here says, Mohican was asleep for a very long time, and now we're waking it back up because we don't want to say it was a dead language. But it was just asleep. And so now we're waking it back up. And so it's been really amazing to be part of that because we know that so much of our culture is tied to our language. Who we are is tied to our language. And that's super important to remember and super important to know because language was one of the first things that was literally beaten out of you when you had to attend a boarding school. So being able to bring that language back is, to see in the time that I've been with the Stockbridge-Munsee community, to see that unfold and to see it happening has just been absolutely so amazing. I myself actually just had, personally, I had a naming ceremony for myself 2 weeks ago now, I think, and it was done in the Munsee language, and it was beautiful. And so my name is in the Munsee language, and it's stunning, and just to have that is wonderful. We have a great historic preservation department, which is actually based out east in New York right now, because our homelands are out there. So we do work a lot with the Delaware tribe and Delaware Nation to make sure that the Lenape interests, the Munsee interests, are held in very importance. And then we also work on our Mohican interests as well. So it's, we're a small community, but we're mighty and we're vibrant. And it's just something very exciting to be a part of. And even though we are not in our ancestral homelands anymore, since 1856, we have made a beautiful home here in Northeast Wisconsin, where the weather is quite chilly today. So got a cup of hot cocoa to keep me warm during this. So thank you so much for having me be part of this. And I'm excited to learn from my elders on this panel as well, from my Munsee elders, and answer any questions that the guests might have. So thank you.
Heather, thank you. That was such a beautiful story. And we can't reiterate how important language is. for Native communities. So thank you for talking about that. Our next speaker, here comes the slide, is Curtis Zunigha. Mr. Zunigha is an enrolled member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and co-founder and co-director of the Lenape Center in New York City. The Lenape Center promotes the history and culture of the Lenape people, also known as the Delaware, through arts, humanities, and environmental activism. He is currently the cultural director for the Delaware Tribe and is an acknowledged expert on Lenape Delaware culture, language, and traditional customs. His multimedia practice includes writing, producing, directing, acting, narrating, and composing and performing traditional music. So I'm very pleased to welcome Curtis Zunigha. Whoops, wrong slide.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. In reference to language, I will begin by saying, He kulumasiyamahash namohomo, duluensi alushi alquis, sakima lenapeuk. And that's in the Unami dialect of the Muncie, of the Lenape language, Muncie being more of the northern dialect. And I greet you today from the tribal headquarters of the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, a small city in the northeastern part of the state of Oklahoma. I am, as stated, an enrolled member of the tribe and also our cultural director. And I wanted to give our audience, our participants, an idea of our origins and our diaspora. And I believe in the packet that was provided, a packet of information called Native Americans in New York, Professional Learning for Educators, there are a couple of maps there. One is right over my shoulder here, but there's a couple of maps, one that shows the original Lenape-Hoking, and then one that shows the diaspora, the forced Lenape migration. Now, as you look at this first screen here with the original Lenape-Hoking, the land of the Lenape, the original homeland, would begin, I approximate, in the foothills of the Catskill Mountains north of New York City. When you get beyond the Catskills, you start getting up into Iroquois country, Haudenosaunee people. But if you take it from that furthermost point north and come down the Hudson River into New York City, then you start including all of New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and even all the way down into the northern part of the state of Delaware around Wilmington. Those are the soft boundaries of what was considered Lenape-Hoking. While both dialects were spoken, the Unami dialect is associated with what they call the people downriver. So that would have been people in more the Philadelphia and New Jersey area, southern Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania. As you get up, kind of start going north of there, the more Muncie dialect speaking Lenape people, that dialect was more prominent. And again, as Chief Peters mentioned, we were there before any of the Europeans showed up. And so when Henry Hudson came on the sloop, the Half Moon, into what's now New York Harbor, and discovering a land where the people lived, he encountered, ultimately, he and those that followed, encountered people that were very ancient in their connection with the land. They were known by neighboring native tribes, as the grandfathers, Mahumsak, the grandfathers, the ancient ones, because of their religion and their stories of being some of the first people. Now, Chief Peters properly stated also that Lenape-Hoking is made up of all kinds of villages that had a language dialect significant to their villages, and as a whole encompassed what is called Lenape-Hoking. So, you know, like in Brooklyn, sub-tribes, subgroups known as the Canarsie and others are written about in history. But after European encounter, the Europeans ostensibly seeking to enter into treaties for trade and commerce and shared occupancy of Lenape lands, those agreements oftentimes were misinterpreted because of the problem of language. And foreign concepts to the Lenape people, owning and selling land was just not a concept that was a part of their understanding of their relationship with the earth. You don't own the land, you don't own the waters, you don't own the air. How can you sell it? And yet there are rather infamous stories in our history, particularly the myth of the so-called sale of Manhattan, which there was no sale. It was an agreement for shared occupancy because the Lenape were kind and welcoming and sought to provide peace and brotherhood and friendship, even with these strange people that came to their land. And unfortunately, because of the difference in cultural values and norms, things like the purchase of Manhattan, which was something that the Lenape didn't understand, they became victims of that alleged transaction, because then the Dutch could build a fort that later became New Amsterdam, the colony of New Amsterdam. And here's something for many of you New Yorkers that may not know this, but the fort that was built around New Amsterdam was meant to keep the Lenape out of their homeland, out of that particular spot of land that supposedly had been sold. That fort was built and the walls were built to keep the Lenape out. And the interior path that went around the perimeter of the fort at New Amsterdam, that path became a road and later a street for a lot of pedestrian and wagon traffic and the like around New Amsterdam. Now, listen to the words I'm saying. There was a wall built to keep the Lenape out, and there was a street at the perimeter of the wall around New Amsterdam. And that is why when you go over to Lower Manhattan, you will see a sign that says Wall Street. That's where the name came from. It was a street inside a wall that kept the Lenape out of the very lands that they shared with the Dutch. Now that's some examples of, there's some very infamous examples of massacres at Pavonia, New Jersey, and others that occurred amongst the Dutch. After the British influence came and New Amsterdam became New York, one of the colonial governors from Virginia that became the governor of the new territory that included now New York, he was Sir Thomas West. And one of his titles of nobility, he was the third Lord de la Warr. De la Warr derived into Delaware. Thus, the native inhabitants, the river valley, everything became known as Delaware. And our history includes being referred to as the Delaware. Lenape is our traditional name in our traditional language, simply meaning the original people. Now, after all of this European encounter, and of course the 13 colonies that became the 13 states of the new United States, and think about how powerful that corridor between New York City and Philadelphia was to the establishment of the 13 colonies and the new United States, remembering that the first Congress met in New York City, right off of Wall Street, by the way. And Washington gave his first inaugural address there. Philadelphia, where William Penn treated with the Lenape, led by the great Sakima Tamanin. These are incredible, powerful moments in the history of the United States, and the Lenape were a partner, a direct partner in these historic events. And yet we ended up being run out of our homeland. Now, the other slide has, which is this one here, has shows a bit of our westward migration that occurred really from the 1780s all the way until the modern day. You'll see up in the upper right-hand corner where it says Delaware. And then you start seeing all these areas going in different directions. Now, I will speak for my band of the Delaware, now today known as Delaware Tribe of Indians. And our diaspora, our westward movement, forced migration, whatever you want to call it, took us out of the homeland through Ohio. And it was during that time that the Continental Army and the new United States coveted a peaceful relationship with the Indians, particularly the Lenape, and an agreement was struck at first so that there would be neutrality between the Lenape, the Delaware, in the War of Independence. Ultimately, the Delaware sided with the Americans, and the first Indian treaty in the history of the United States occurred on September 17, 1778, the Treaty of Fort Pitt, wherein the Delaware treated with the United States, agreed to provide warriors, horses, corn, provisions, safe passage through the Lenape territory for the Continental Army. In exchange, there was a promise for the establishment of a all-Indian state with representation in the American Congress. Yes, the Lenape were going to be the head of an Indian state. We almost had a 14th star in the flag of the United States. We came that close. But as we know, with almost all treaties with Indians, they were broken. And when they no longer needed the Lenape, we were pushed out. Now, my tribe's migration then continued through Ohio, and we suffered continuous massacres, racist, murderous, marauding bands of white people that would kill Indians. There were scalp bounties. There were all kinds of things going on. This is the legacy that we had to carry with us as we left. After we go through Ohio, we go into Indiana. We were in Indiana for a while along the White River. And there were Muncie people too, because today there remains Muncie, Indiana, which is the home of Ball State University. Leaving Indiana, we went on across the Mississippi River during the time of the Andrew Jackson removal. We spent about 5 to 10 years apiece on a reservation in southeastern Missouri near Cape Girardeau. At one point, a small group of our people split off and they went down, way down south into Texas and Old Mexico, while the main band went on into southwestern Missouri in an area along the James River near present-day Springfield, and we had a reservation there for a few years. And it's about where, and you may have heard of this place, Branson, Missouri is. Very popular tourist spot. If we'd have left our reservation there, I could have had a supper club with my name on the marquee if I'd have stayed there, but that didn't happen. We moved onward. We weren't happy with our reservation in Missouri. Then we went to Kansas, and we had a reservation in the corridor between Leavenworth and Lawrence, Kansas, between 1830 and 1866. After the Civil War, our reservation was coveted by the railroad companies, and we were forced to sign a treaty on July 4th, 1866, and be removed from our reservation in Kansas and brought down into the Indian Territory. At the same time, on the same date, if you look in the history books, on July 4th, 1866, the United States entered into a treaty with the Cherokee Nation and forced them to settle so-called friendly Indian tribes into the Indian Territory. So in 1867, a delegation selected a piece of land. They came down into the Indian Territory. As soon as they crossed the border into the Indian Territory out of Kansas, they found the Caney River. They found a place that they thought would be a good area to settle. The Cherokees were very influential in making sure that those Delawares stay clustered up there in that far northwestern corner of the Cherokee Nation, because they wanted us to be a buffer between them and those wild Osages who are on the other side of the 96th meridian on their new reservation. And those wild Osages were still riding around on horseback, shooting buffaloes and a few Cherokees. So they put the Delawares up there to make sure we were a buffer. We were known as being also fierce warriors, scouts, frontiersmen, but we were also known for being peacemakers on the frontier. And that our diplomacy and our ancient presence in the eyes and the minds of so many Native people is what kept us together. Above all, our language and our culture was an extremely important part of who we are, because we carried all along that trail. The Cherokees have their migratory trail they call the Trail of Tears. I call the Delaware Trail the Trail of Broken Treaties. But no matter what, we always kept with us our religion, our language, and our culture. And we kept it even in the face of the most egregious depredations that were that occurred on us. The land theft, the genocide, the actions of so many people that would push the Delaware away. And then once we came into the Indian Territory, then the federal government got away from an extermination policy and into an assimilation policy. And during that time was the advent of the Indian boarding schools run by the federal government in conjunction with Christian missionaries. And the concept was to separate a generation of children from their parents and reprogram their little minds and punish them for being Indian, punish them for speaking their language, punish them for having their hair long and wearing moccasins and all, and to convert them. And therefore, we today have endured and we remain a federally recognized tribe. We have about 10,000 total members, and we have tribal property here in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, where we offer an array of modern social services, and we keep language and culture very active and vibrant part of our tribal community. And I'm ever so grateful to be a part of that. And I'm grateful to our ancestors for the sacrifices they made so that I can be a part of this conversation and share that with you. Wanishi.
Great. Thank you, Curtis, for such an elegant description of the history, the forceful removal of Lenape people, and your eventual settlement into Oklahoma. That was beautiful. And our final speaker, our last and final speaker, is Joe Baker. Mr. Baker is an enrolled member also of the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and he is co-founder and executive director of the Lenape Center in New York City. He is also an artist, curator, educator, and currently the executive director of the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center in Ledyard, Connecticut. I welcome Mr. Baker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, we're live, we're ready. Good afternoon. Thank you for including me as a panelist on for this important discussion. My thanks go out to the Brooklyn Public Library, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, and of course, my fellow tribal members, Lenape people from different nations as we gather here today. I think that the prior discussions will give our audience a very keen understanding of what complex history we are faced with when we have a discussion regarding the history of Lenape people and a better understanding of Lenape-Hoking. I would like to share with you that my family, the White Turkey family, arrived in my my Oklahoma homeland in 1867 from that reservation in Kansas that Curtis spoke of. And there we settled in that small community along the banks of the Caney River, Dewey, Oklahoma. What was not understood at that time as allotment status Indians is that much of that land, which was awarded to allotees of the Delaware tribe of Indians, would become oil-rich, oil-producing lands. So not only were the Lenape people, not only had they encountered this complex history of genocide and forced removal, but upon finally arriving in what was to be the last settlement of Lenape people for my tribe in Oklahoma, they encountered the reality of land theft, murder, and discrimination beyond description. So it really didn't end with the forced removals and broken treaties. It continued into present day Oklahoma Indian Territory. And I would offer, in many ways, continues today with disparities in health and education and opportunities for Lenape people. So now I want to fast forward to 2008. Growing up in Oklahoma, I had the privilege of growing up among fluent native speakers, which I understood to be a unique experience. I understood that we were unique and distinct individuals, members of tribal community. And that has helped inform my trajectory today, my life and pattern, my movement. Growing up in Oklahoma, I grew up around tribal elder Nora Thompson Dean, who began a series of return trips to the homeland, Lenape-Hoking, in the 1970s. She returned primarily at the invitation of universities and anthropologists. She was visiting institutions here in New York, but also New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And it was Nora's words that inspired in me this curiosity to know more about where we come from, to know more about the ancestral land. So keeping that within me and growing up, in 2008, many different trips to New York prior to that, I, along with the co-founder and co-director, Adrian Kumans, were standing on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And there was this very distinct awareness or feeling that we, the Lenape, were actually being relegated to people of the past. We were no longer thought of as living, vibrant communities, but people, historical people, people who once lived in Lenape-Hoking. And there was really no understanding of what became of this vast nation. How were they dispersed? What happened? It wasn't being taught in the schools. There was some, mention of Lenape place names within Manhattan, but there was really nothing to really describe our vitality and that was expressed within these different displaced communities of Lenape people within the US and Canada. So that became the beginning of the idea for Lenape Center, and co-directors Curtis Zunigha and Brent Michael Davids joined us in our efforts to continue Lenape-Hoking here in the Manhattan area. And by continuing, I mean providing access for our Lenape people to education, to culture, to the rich civic opportunities that are inherent in Manhattan, that is our ancestral land. And it would seem to me that there's also unlimited opportunities for our tribal nations to, as sovereign nations, to begin government-to-government relations with the city of New York and the state of New York. Imagine what could be if our tribal communities or our federally recognized groups were to enter into and engage in government-to-government relations with this city that we know as Manhattan, and what cultural richness and opportunity could be provided for our Lenape people. How do we express ourselves as Lenape Center? We express ourselves through partnerships and opportunities for collaboration that create new arts venues, new arts experiences, new ways of people coming together, symposia, educational opportunities. We provide educational tools for schools within the Manhattan area and beyond. We have currently an amazing project going on with Seed Shed in partnership with that group along the Hudson River. We're growing corn and beans so that they can be returned to our communities in different areas throughout the country and Canada. So the opportunities are here. The desire is here to continue Lenape-Hoking and to not be viewed as people of the past and people of people who have been denied access to their ancestral lands and the opportunities and the richness and the resources and that are here and waiting for Lenape people, which is the just and true expression of what we can access today. So Nancy, I hope that gives you an idea sort of Lenape Center and where we're headed. You know, I know there are going to be lots of questions about what we can do to respond to contemporary issues confronting our communities, confronting our institutions, the impact of this pandemic, how it's affecting our lives, how do we come together as people and make in our efforts a new future for all people.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. That was beautiful. And there are a lot of great questions, which I want to allow time for. But, you know, let's take a look at what has been said, because this whole idea of what people do not know about Lenape history is so important. What teachers may not know, what they can share with their students. I think this idea that that the Lenape are being denied or have been denied their past. And so if each of you could at least share with the teachers who are with us, besides Joe, you all have made some allusion to issues that are important to you, but what do you think teachers, are there other things that teachers do not know about Lenape history and the Lenape people that you'd like to share?
At Lenape Center, our experience has been sort of a void or lack of information about Lenape history. We entertain questions every week from educators throughout New York, throughout the Northeast, asking what books are good, where can I find historical information about Lenape people. And, you know, we refer people to our website, and that's a good source to begin with. And also I would mention that our tribe, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, has a very solid, good website that's full of great information that's accessible to people, easily accessible. And I would recommend they go there. And I know the other tribal nations have as well websites that have really accurate and important knowledge. And it's a good place to go for that.
Yeah, I think in the teacher's packet, there is a reference to the different websites. Is that correct? I do believe, well, here's one for the Delaware Tribe. The Lenape Center website, it would be great if that could be listed on the chat line. Do anybody, Curtis, Mark, or Heather, do you have any other? Mark, go ahead.
Okay, is that better? Okay, got a couple things noted here. First of all, I guess we're talking a little bit about who we are right now, but it's also important to understand who we were way back when, and that there's a certain stereotype that seems to have developed and exists over time that's contrary to reality, I guess you could say. I mean, we believed in this creator, Kishala Mokwang, who was kind and generous and charitable and provided all that we needed here in the land. And, we had a duty to give thanks to Kishala Mokwang and also to live in a similar kind and charitable way. These are the types of principles that kids learn from a very early age. And as well as principles like truth, honesty, and respect. We had our own system of education that taught children these important principles and enabled them to practice them throughout the rest of their lives. We had our own systems of government, our own economy, our own marriage systems and ways of dealing with death through funerals, immense resources. And we were we lived very long and healthy lives. And we had a very good, well-functioning society at the time of contact. And if you were to take a look at the observation of Giovanni da Verrazzano when he sailed along the Northeast coast in 1524, you'll see a lot of that if you were to read about his descriptions of his visits to various villages along the way, which, include people such as ours. So I think that's important.
Anybody else want to comment on that? I had some general questions, but there are a whole bunch of sort of complex questions that we're getting from the audience, and I'm wondering if it makes sense to just pivot directly to them, so the teachers are hearing answers to some of those. One early on in the program from Kat says, despite the widespread distribution of Lenape Delaware peoples, are there any commonalities still in existence? For example, ceremonies, clothing, common words, etc. I mean, you talked about language and the Unami language and the Muncie language that's spoken broadly. Are there any other customs you'd like to talk about or commonalities?
Well, I would say that, we have kept our social dances, we have kept our art, we have kept the general aesthetics, and that's expressed in our clothing that we wear and the beadwork that we do and the moccasins that we make, which are very specific to Lenape people. You are very much understood and identified by your moccasins, and those have continued. And I know Curtis, you can also speak to this.
Well, yes, indeed. Again, as we all traveled that migratory trail to our present day habitat, we carried with us language, culture, and tradition, and religious ceremonies, principally the Chingui Kaun, or the Big House Church ceremony, was something that was carried up to Canada and to Oklahoma. But it was perceived, particularly in the early 20th century, as some sort of a heathen or pagan practice. And fundamentalist Christians saw that as a blasphemy. And that was part of the reason why they continued to discriminate against people like the Lenape for practicing this. And through the boarding schools and other social pressures, that ended that ceremony in 1924 here in Oklahoma. But language, customs and traditions, even variations of the Big House, continued on from generation to generation. Our cultural values and teachings are to honor the ancestors, to recognize the sacrifices that they endured to pass that on to another generation. And in the succeeding generations, it is our obligation to honor those ancestors and hold on to what we have and to pass it on to the next generation. As Joe mentioned, an incredible woman in our tribe's history, Nora Thompson Dean, Touching Leaves woman. She traveled back in the 70s, back to New York, back to Pennsylvania, back to New Jersey, up to Canada. She became an ambassador of cultural goodwill and inspired a generation of younger people to do the same. And therefore, even though we're like spread out all over the place, Canada, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and we didn't often talk to each other then, with the advent of modern communication, we've been able to schedule gatherings where we all come together and we share the Lenape spirit with each other. Chief Peters knows about this. We've been at many gatherings over the last 25 years in Ohio, in Oklahoma, in Canada, in New York, in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. And I think it coming together and sharing various aspects of our current day tribal communities and the way we practice our culture, we find a lot of commonality, but it's also like a family homecoming wherever we assemble. And I think that's very important because it inspires us to hold on to the gift of our culture and our language that was given to us, and it's reinforced when we gather together. And I think that's how we've been able to stay strong and alive to this day.
Thank you, Curtis. There have been questions about the recent Supreme Court ruling in Oklahoma and the impact that is having on the nations, the many nations, including the two Delaware tribes in Oklahoma. Any comments about that?
Nancy, I'm going to have to pass on that. That is so complex, and in the short amount of time we have, that could be, look, even the Indian law scholars in the state of Oklahoma are still struggling to try to come up with something, and we're dealing with the federal Department of Justice, tribal courts. We're still trying to sort all that out. It's too complex for this right now, but it is a serious, ongoing, and really a daily matter here in Oklahoma right now.
Yeah, I am sure. So, okay, so early on there was a question, and this is going way back, the maps of New York and Flatbush. Someone asked a question about Flatbush Avenue being one of the original Lenape Pass in New York, in Brooklyn. I don't know if any of you, they asked if there were maps about that or where she could learn more about that history of Lenape Pass in Brooklyn. Mark, you have to unmute.
I have a book here somewhere. It was written around 1914 by a guy named Mark Harrington. No, it's somebody else. It's called Trails of New York.
I think it was Bolton, Reginald
Bolton, yes, Bolton.
Helen Bolton.
You know, there's a lot of trails. A lot of these roads are based on old trails, and I wouldn't doubt if Flatbush is one of those as well. And I don't know if Brooklyn's included in this book, but it might be. So.
Yeah, it is. It is. So that if someone could type in the reference, Molly, maybe you can, about the Reginald Helen Bolton book on Indian trails. There was also a question from someone asked, do you know of a map showing Native American trails along the Susquehanna River? I live in Center Village and have found hundreds of artifacts along the bank. I believe I saw a map once that showed Lackawanna Trail following what is now Route 79, but now I can't find it. I read the Susquehanna River expedition and have become fascinated with the archaeology. I have found a number of effigy tools, an eagle, a bear, and a turtle. I appreciate any additional insights that you could provide.
Regarding trails and pathways and of the American Indian, the Lenape, and their location, I think what is important to remember is that anywhere you stand here in the Northeast, in any place, you are standing on ancestral land. So it doesn't have to be a trail in Flatbush. It can be, 91st Street and 5th Avenue. It can be in Central Park. It can be down on Wall Street. Anywhere you stand, you're standing on ancestral land. And that, I think, is what's important to remember. There's often this idea, and we hear this a lot expressed by people, to take us to your sacred places. Take us to those places. And all of the land is sacred. It's all ancestral. It's all it's living, and it's Mother Earth is a sacred being. It's everywhere. It's in the land. It's in the air. It's in the sky. It's in the trees.
Thank you. Another question was to Heather, to clarify about fee land versus trust land.
Oh yeah, so oh yeah, I think I did mention that earlier when I was talking about our land here. A very simple, straight to the point clarification between fee land and trust land is reservations are trust land. They're held in trust, and that trust is held by the federal government, and the tribe gets to dictate what happens on their land. So like the United States, like the state you live in, like the cities you live in, there are ordinances and laws and things like that that the tribal nations can govern. Fee land is land that is owned by an individual that has been bought. So for example, but it can also be something that is bought by a tribe. So for example, you have Native nations sometimes buying back ancestral land or reservation land that is held, it's in fee land, so it is subject to state, local, and federal taxes. And then there's a process that lasts about a decade of taking that land and converting it from fee land to trust land. So where the tribe, the Native nation or the tribe then has the right to say what happens on that land. But until that land is put into trust land, the biggest difference is it is subjected to state and local and federal taxes. That's the easiest definition.
Wow, thank you. So are there aspects of contemporary art and culture that the teachers can highlight in their lesson plans about the Lenape people? Any suggestions of what they could cover?
Nancy, if I may start with a response, at the moment, I'm wearing two hats. I'm representing the Delaware tribe as the cultural director, but I'm also a co-director at Lenape Center. And that is part of the mission of Lenape Center. That's why I wanted you to address the land acknowledgement statement and how the Brooklyn Library is committed to addressing the lack of inclusion or the erasure of the Lenape people. And I hope that this workshop, this session that we're having will create a lot of questions that in collaboration with the Brooklyn Library and the museum, we can provide additional resources for teachers and the like. We're not going to all fit it in this one phone call. The Lenape Center, however, is working hard to overcome the lack of inclusion and the erasure of the Lenape people, to overcome the fact that we're always referred to in the past, but not in the present. That it's like, well, we look around and we don't see the Lenape. Where are they? Where is the Lenape Center? We're trying to come back after centuries and to assume our rightful place in our homeland. But when people don't even know about us, it's hard to take our place at the table. And so that's what we're trying to do, and even in collaboration right now with the museum and the library with this workshop, is to overcome the erasure. And artistically, one of the first activities that the Lenape Center engaged in was commissioning a brilliant musician from the Stockbridge-Munsee Reservation, Brent Michael Davids, who later became a co-director at Lenape Center. Brent wrote a performance opera called Purchase of Manhattan, an opera. And we staged it at the sanctuary of the Marble Collegiate Church in Midtown Manhattan. And it was an incredible success because here you had a native composer writing an opera performed by orchestra and professional opera singers. It was amazing. I was so grateful to be a part of that. But there's an example right there. Again, contemporary expressions of traditional themes. That's something that the Lenape stands for. You know, we want to bring back artists, musicians, scholars who are Lenape people that have been displaced over the generations, but we want to bring them back to the homeland and where we can all take a rightful place and have a greater presence. The arts is a wonderful medium to do that because we have a lot of talent out there. And I'm going to focus on this term once again, which I really picked up from Joe Baker, and that is contemporary expressions of traditional themes of art, language, culture, and other aspects of who we are. And I think that will elevate our identity and our position back in the homeland.
Yeah, yeah.
That's, if I may, I just want to follow up on Curtis's thoughts. If we can think a little further about the arts, and the question was, where could we go to learn more about Lenape art? The museums, that Western model has done in many ways a disservice to American Indian people in that they have become collections of objects, objets d'art. They are held in collections, they're held in the archives of institutions and removed from the cultures, the living cultures that they have been created for. And so frequently people, in terms of the Native American field of art, they look for traditional arts, and they tend to overlook the contemporary arts. But Native Americans express themselves in all art forms today: dance, music, theater, rap, the spoken word. It's a full gamut of expressions. It's not just reserved to those traditional forms. And we have amazing artists today working in very challenging mediums to express contemporary issues that impact our society, because we live and work and express ourselves coming from that traditional place, but in today's world. We have to bring this notion of the Indian into the present day.
I'm getting sorry, I'm looking at the question on my phone. Okay, so would any of the panelists be open to commenting on the implications of living land acknowledgements and how to genuinely make the commitments to Native communities that they imply? And then the second part of that question is, are there current repatriation and land access efforts between your communities and organizations in places like museums, New York City parks, etc.? It's a big question.
A huge question. It's a very detailed question. I have to think, so I'm going to defer to my elders on this panel for this.
All right, I'll jump in here real quick and say that here in the States, we have a Tribal Historic Preservation Office, which is most often federally funded and provides the capacity for tribes to coordinate with collections and to locate sacred objects, human remains, funerary objects, and other things that belong to the native people that need to be repatriated and not either hidden in boxes in a warehouse or displayed on shelves in museums and libraries where they don't belong there. Oftentimes they were taken, stolen, or uncovered by archaeologists. You know, we don't have Indian archaeology teams that do that, but we've had to now hire people so that they can understand the field of archaeology and be a part of these endeavors. A lot of things that we've learned, we got from Herb Kraft at Seton Hall University, and we keep a couple of his books on the shelves, but he also helped us identify human remains and funerary objects that our tribal historic preservation offices have been a part of the repatriation effort. In addition to that, however, I also want to make reference to the land acknowledgement statement. However elegant the statement may be, that last sentence, Nancy, was so important, and why I tried to underscore it, because you can stand there and make a lovely statement. We acknowledge we're on the land of the Lenape people, and we honor their presence in the history of the world and all of that. You know, it all sounds good, but unless you follow up and start reversing the process of the last several generations, which erased us, then your statement is really only going to make you feel good about yourself, because we're still in the past. And in order to be part of the present, we have to be engaged with the communities of power, whether they are education, economic, religious, social, whatever the case may be. These are the people that hold on to the power in great cities like New York City. And we need to be at the table with them. And we can only be at the table with them to change these institutions that hold all of the power, and hold that power oftentimes with old ways of thinking, the kind of thinking that ran the Lenape off, killed them, exterminated them, erased them. So the Brooklyn Museum and the library can be part of ongoing programming, scholarly, artistic, and otherwise, to overcome that erasure. And that's where I believe the strength of a land acknowledgement statement should take us. Acknowledge the past, but find a way to learn from that and move forward with the Lenape people.
And if I could piggyback on what Curtis was saying, particularly to the land acknowledgement part too, I think it's so important to that I'm really glad that that last sentence was pointed out in the Brooklyn Museum's land acknowledgement, because that's huge. And so for the Stockbridge-Munsee community, for our cultural affairs department, we came up with the land acknowledgement as well, because we do get so many requests for land acknowledgements because we are no longer in our ancestral territories. But like what we've included in ours is there's an action item that you have to do, because yes, as you know, Curtis just said, you can make that beautiful and lovely land acknowledgement, but it's just words until you put something into action. And so that's why with us, we've included an action item, and we ask that people do include action items in their land acknowledgements, but also make reference to the contemporary. So yes, you're on the ancestral homelands of the Lenape or the Mohican or the Oneida, but acknowledge where they are today, because I think, at least for us, for the Stockbridge-Munsee, well, not least for us, because the Lenape, my Lenape brothers and sisters also have that, we're not out east. So people forget that we even existed. And for the particular Mohican people, there's a novel out there that's called Last of the Mohicans. And so we are constantly having to fight against that every day. I mean, I give a lecture, I introduce myself, and people go, wait, you thought the Mohicans didn't exist? And I'm like, no, I'm standing right in front of you. Or in the time of a pandemic, I'm on a Zoom call with you. I'm right here. So I think it's super important to acknowledge that contemporary and where the people are today. Like, we have a thriving, beautiful community here in Northeast Wisconsin. And in terms of repatriation with objects and ancestors, absolutely. One of the programs I oversee here is our historic preservation program. And so we do a lot of work with repatriation of sacred objects, funerary objects, objects that are in museums. We're actually in the middle of one right now that's going very well. But we also want to make sure our ancestors are not sitting on shelves, and that they're, put back where they belong, that they're given the chance to, continue their journey across to the other side. And so that's something that's super important, that we work with state and federal agencies to make sure that these that our people are brought home, that our objects are brought home, and it should be something that should be done automatically, but it isn't. And sometimes it is actually an uphill battle. And don't get me wrong, I am a history nerd to the max, and I love going to museums and seeing things, but there are just some things that don't belong in museums, that belong back with the Native Nation. And so that's something that we work on a lot with our historic preservation program out east and here in Wisconsin.
And I'd like to add to that, for those in the audience who are wanting to learn more about living land acknowledgements, we at Lenape Center give actual workshops where you can contact Lenape Center and learn more about how to actually come up with an effective and meaningful land acknowledgement. And the other thing I think it's important to think about land acknowledgement is that it's a relationship. It's a relationship, and it has to be a commitment. And as Heather said, action. You have to have action items. That's important. You have to take positive steps to bring that into a reality that's meaningful and purposeful.
I agree with the previous three statements regarding land acknowledgement. There has to be some substance to it. Am I being heard? Okay. There has to be some substance to it, more than just words. And we talked about that at the museum a couple of years ago, I recall. And we had tables set aside to discuss sort of plans of action, I suppose, as to the type of things that could be done. But, that's something that we're working on. I can see, and the Lenape Center is doing that as well. As far as repatriation is concerned, we have a bit of a problem here because we have a border between ourselves and people in America that has an impact on us. We're trying to find ways to get standing for issues relating to past events in the United States and America, and we'll manage to do that. But presently, the way the laws and policies are written, we can't technically access certain items in museums under NIPRA and other laws, because we're not federally recognized in the United States of America at this time. We were invited to the Smithsonian last year, and they've changed their policy to include people from Canada now for repatriation purposes. And we're hoping other institutions might do the same. But like I say, we are presently working on finding a way to have the type of standing in America that we should have, having, come from that area originally. So.
So this is a good segue into the next question, which is, what kind of relationships do your communities have with the tribes that have stayed in New York, such as the Shinnecock, the Montauk, the Matinacock?
We have a powwow every year, and many of those people come up to our powwow every year, and we attend events down that way. And I guess try to keep a certain relationship intact. I've gone through the history of that area in the early years fairly significantly and into the 17 and 1800s. And there are people that have stayed behind in those areas and managed to continue to survive and have their certain identities. And we've, like I say, developed relationships over the years and continue to do so.
Nancy, this is a very complex question because there's various criteria for recognition. And it has even caused, at times, disagreements, and at other times, it's led to reunions of families of people with common ancestry. The disagreements often occur as to who the modern day incarnation of people who claim to have remained in Lenape Hoking and survived a period of time when they were hunted and exterminated or had to change their identity, intermarried with white, black, and others for survival. It's one thing to recognize somebody's blood ancestry, but it's another thing to begin to recognize groups of people that are organized in various under various criteria, from a nonprofit arts organization to a self-proclaimed government with like court systems and taxing their people and all of that kind of stuff. It's very complex, and not everyone recognizes every group. And sometimes we end up arguing amongst ourselves, and that complexity doesn't provide definitive information about who the people are that are expressing themselves today as modern day residents of New Jersey and New York. I think you need to have, as we discovered in the past when the Brooklyn Museum put on a symposium, and I believe Mark was there, I know Joe was there, my chief, Chet Brooks, was there. Perhaps you can open up and let those people speak for themselves. But that complex relationship or lack of relationship is something that's been haunting us. And yet there are times when all of that legal and political stuff is set aside, and I've sat in a circle with a fire, hitting that water drum or shaking a rattle, and representatives from all kinds of communities come together and share the ancestral spirit through our songs and dances. And we don't keep people out. One thing that Nora Dean taught us, if you're going to learn an authentic way and learn it with respect. And that's the way you'll respect the people who come forward and are expressing themselves as today's modern Lenape descendants. So maybe another workshop and you bring in some other people at another time, but that's how complex it is. Sometimes we don't always recognize each other, and that complexity makes a lot of problems. Even here in Oklahoma, we go through circumstances where we have the Christians don't recognize the Jews, and the Jews don't recognize the Muslims, and the Baptists don't recognize each other at the liquor store.
Yeah.
That's a joke. That's a joke.
I'm
Dang.
like, I'm focusing on my phone and what you're saying. The one thing I wanted to comment just for the teachers, because they can look this up, is that what Curtis is talking about is federally recognized tribes, state recognized tribes. These are sort of political categories that the federal government has put on Native American people. So the colonialism continues in these political structures that have been forced on Native people. So look that up. I've just been one final question, that because we're almost at ending time, we have to end soon, is what is the one thing you would like all students in New York City to know about Lenape history or contemporary culture? And if each of you could give us that one thing that you feel is important.
I would hope that we would be understood as a living culture, as people of today, with a great ancestry and legacy of positiveness, and I think that's important. People of today.
And I'll say that the Lenape are still here, and people such as you've had on this panel discussion, we are the living embodiment of the Lenape people. We are still here, and we have survived because of the enduring Lenape spirit of our ancestors given to us by our creator, Keshe Lemuko.
I would say that also that we are here, we are survivors, and that we are resilient. And it doesn't matter what you throw our way, we're going to overcome it. And I am honored and privileged to be part of this panel with these great elders and to learn so much from them as I sit here as I'm a little baby historian. I'm honored to be part of this, and that I'm honored to be a historian and tell our story. So yeah, resiliency, it doesn't matter what you throw at us. The Stockbridge-Munsee, Delaware, the Lenape, we're still here and we're strong.
Okay, I'd just like to say thank you. But I guess modern culture is seeming to change in a way to reflect old traditional values that we have had and continue to have even until this day. I mean, we are starting to look at systems moving towards a more resolution based approach rather than this adversarial type of way of doing things that we've had to abide by for many years. Back in the 60s or so, hitting kids was a regular thing as a way of punishment and threats and such, but we never had these types of behaviors in our communities way back when. And so you see culture changing today, in a sense, coming in line with the way we were many years ago and try to continue to be today. That's all I got to say.
Okay, well, we're at our time, and I believe there are some closing remarks. I don't know who Was Caitlin going to come on or?
Yes, I am here. Hopefully you all can see my screen again. Again, I'm Caitlin from the Center for Brooklyn History. I want to give a really heartfelt thanks to our panelists for being here today. You can't hear the roaring applause, but I can personally say that I've been so moved by all the things that you've shared with us, by your testimonies, by your calls to action, and I am overwhelmingly humbled to have you in our midst today. So thank you so much. In a wrap up, I just want to invite everybody to come to part 2 tomorrow. So a lot of you expressed in the Q&A and in the chat that you would like resources now. You want resources for teaching these issues in your classes, and tomorrow we are going to share resources. So if you haven't done so already, please consider registering for tomorrow. We have a code up, discount day 2. You can receive a $5 discount, and we are going to offer transferable lesson ideas for understanding historical bias in sources, as well as strategies for engaging your students with these beautiful histories and tragic histories and the contemporary culture that our panelists spoke about today. We also hope that you'll consider joining us for our future PLs, both at the Center for Brooklyn History and at Brooklyn Museum. These are a few examples of many that are to come this school year. So certainly visit our websites to hear more. You can also join our prospective mailing list to receive notification as soon as those opportunities become available. And then finally, I would like to conclude with an urgent request for you all to fill out a short survey about your experience today. As we navigate this new world, this new virtual world, I can sincerely say that your feedback will directly impact the way we offer our future professional development opportunities. This survey is also your key to CTLE credit for those New York State educators that need CTLE credit. So you will have an option at the end of the survey to enter your details for this purpose. Only those that fill out the survey will receive credit. So I'm going to repeat that again. Only those who fill out this survey will receive CTLE credit. So it's essential that you fill out the survey. And then those that request it, you should keep your eyes on your email. By the end of the week, we will actually send you a copy of your official CTLE form. On behalf of Brooklyn Public Library Center for Brooklyn History and the Brooklyn Museum, again, I would like to sincerely thank you all for being here with us, and I hope that we'll get to see some of you tomorrow. And we will also share these resources with you after the fact. So thank you again. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you. Anishik.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Nishi.
Okay.
All right, Wanishi, are we to leave the conversation now?
I guess, yes. You
All right.
guys have a nice evening. Thank you so much, Mark, Curtis, Heather.